John had never planned to visit the shelter that day. The sky was overcast, and the air was heavy with the kind of humidity that presses down on the chest, the kind that makes everything feel slower, heavier, more difficult. He had just finished a long shift at the auto repair shop, his hands still stained with grease, his boots dragging across the sidewalk. He was supposed to turn right toward home, toward the quiet apartment with the creaky floorboards and the empty couch. But his truck kept going straight, his hands on the wheel, not turning, as if guided by something deeper than thought or logic, something old and aching and unresolved. It had been 3 years since he had lost Max, and still the wound felt raw, like it had only just happened last week. Max had been more than a dog. He had been John's shadow, his protector, his friend. From the moment John adopted him as a puppy from a small farm outside of town, they had been inseparable. Max rode in the truck with him, sat beside him during long fishing trips, barked at shadows when they camped in the forest together, and lay his head on John's lap whenever the nights got too quiet too still. Max was brave but gentle, loyal but never needy, the kind of dog people notice and remember, the kind that leaves a hole when he is gone. John could still remember every second of the day he lost him. The storm had come out of nowhere, fierce and wild. Lightning split the sky and thunder rolled through the mountains as they hiked down from a ridge. Max had panicked, bolted into the woods, chasing a sound, or maybe trying to protect him. John had screamed his name for hours, had run through the underbrush with a flashlight, slipping in the mud, clawing through branches, blood on his arms and rain in his eyes, until he could not shout anymore, and his voice gave out. He searched for days after that, brought friends and flyers, and even called in a tracker, but it was as if Max had vanished into the trees, leaving nothing behind but silence and loss. Since that day, John had avoided shelters, avoided the pain of seeing dogs that were not Max, avoided the guilt that came whenever he thought of getting another pet, as if replacing Max would be some kind of betrayal. And yet today something changed. Maybe it was the weather, or the way the light hit the road, or maybe it was that dream he had last night, the one where Max came running out of the fog, tail wagging, eyes bright like they used to be. But whatever it was, it pulled him forward, not fast, not urgent, just steady and strange, like his feet already knew where they were going before his mind caught up. The shelter looked the same as it always had, small brick building with a sagging sign and a row of tired cars parked out front. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and wet fur and something else, something sad, a kind of quiet that settled at the corners like dust. John stepped through the doors, hands in his pockets, trying not to make eye contact with the receptionist. He nodded when asked if he needed help, but said he just wanted to look, and she smiled like she had heard that 1,000 times and waved him down the hallway where the kennels waited. He walked slowly past the cages, some dogs barking, some pacing, some lying motionless, with eyes that watched him without blinking. He tried not to look too closely, tried to keep his thoughts blank, but it was impossible. Every tail wag, every whimper, every hopeful look tore at something inside him, reminding him of Max, of the way he used to tilt his head when confused, or how he would paw gently at John's leg when he wanted attention. And just when John thought he could not take another step, something changed. A silence fell around him, and his eyes were drawn to the last kennel at the end of the row, and his heart began to race without reason, as if it already knew what his eyes had not yet seen. John stood still at the end of the hallway, a strange quiet falling over him like a heavy coat wrapping around his shoulders. The sounds of barking and claws on concrete seemed to fade behind him until all he could hear was the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the sound of his own breathing. He felt a chill run up his spine as he turned slowly toward the last kennel, unsure of what had pulled him there, unsure of what he expected to see. His boots echoed softly against the floor as he took a step forward, then another, drawn not by thought, but by something that felt older, something deep in his chest that had been waiting quietly all this time. The dog was lying in the back corner of the cage, his fur dull, and his eyes heavy, as if he had long since stopped expecting anything good to come through the door. His ears twitched at the sound of footsteps, but he did not move, not at first, not until John came closer, and then the dog lifted his head slowly, deliberately, like someone waking from a long-forgotten dream, and their eyes met across the space between metal bars and memories. John felt something break open inside of him, something fragile and buried, something that ached without warning. His breath caught in his throat, and his hands began to tremble, because there was something familiar in the way the dog looked at him, not just recognition, but something deeper, a kind of remembering that could not be explained, only felt. The dog stood slowly, legs stiff from disused ribs, faintly visible under his thick coat, his eyes locked on John's, and then he let out a sound that stopped everything, a low, quiet cry, not of pain, not of fear, but of longing, of recognition, a soft, desperate noise that carried more weight than any bark or howl could have, and John took a step forward, then dropped to one knee, his hands reaching out instinctively, fingers curling around the cold metal of the gate. "Hey boy," he whispered, though the words were barely more than breath, his voice cracking as he said it again. "Hey boy," and the dog moved closer step by step, like he could not quite believe it either, his body shaking just slightly with each step until his nose touched John's fingers through the bars, and the cry came again, softer this time, like a sob. John felt his throat tighten, his eyes burn with tears that had not come in years. His mind raced with disbelief, with hope, with fear, with a desperate need to be wrong, and yet also to be right, because it could not be Max, and yet it felt like Max, it looked like Max, smelled like Max, the way his eyes softened when they looked at him, the way his tail gave one uncertain wag before curling back under his legs, and the way he pressed his head harder against John's hand, as if he was afraid it would vanish if he let go. He glanced toward the front of the shelter, toward the desk and the hallway, but he could not bring himself to stand. He could not move away from the dog, not yet, not until he was sure, because his heart was already starting to believe what his mind still resisted, the idea that this dog, this tired, wounded animal behind the bars, could be the same one he lost in the woods years ago, the same one he mourned and dreamed about and missed with every corner of his life, that used to be filled with companionship and now echoed with silence. A woman from the shelter staff appeared around the corner, clipboard in hand, and paused when she saw the scene unfolding. Her face shifted from neutral professionalism to quiet wonder, and she stepped forward slowly, like someone approaching a miracle. She did not say anything at first, only watched and waited, and when John finally looked up from the dog, from the eyes that would not stop staring into his, she gave him a soft, gentle nod and said, "I think we need to check his chip." John did not move as the woman stepped closer, her voice quiet but clear as she said she would be right back with the scanner. He nodded, barely aware of anything, but the weight of the dog's gaze still pressed against his hand. The dog stood there, unmoving, like a statue made of breath and memory, eyes locked on John, as if afraid to blink, as if blinking might make him disappear again. John whispered his name again, Max, not loud, not commanding, just gentle and hopeful and unsure, and the dog made a sound again, a deep low noise that vibrated in the chest, more felt than heard, and it made something in John crack even further. The woman returned, holding a small device in one hand. She crouched near the gate, her movements slow and careful. The dog did not move except to glance at her briefly, then turned his eyes back to John like nothing else mattered. She reached through the gate, gently brushing the scanner along the dog's neck, searching for the chip, and then with a small beep the device lit up, and her eyes flicked to the screen. She read silently for a moment, her lips parting just slightly before she looked at John with something between shock and disbelief. She asked him what his name was, and when John answered, she smiled, not in the way people smile when they are happy, but in the way people smile when the impossible has just been proven real. She looked at the screen again, then at the dog, then back at John, and said, "His name is Max, and the chip is registered to you." She paused like the words needed time to land, to settle in the air. She told him the chip had been flagged as missing for 3 years, and that he had been brought in only 2 weeks ago, found wandering near the edge of the woods, thin and scared, and covered in burrs, but otherwise uninjured. John could not speak for a moment. The world tilted slightly under his feet, and he gripped the bars tighter. The name, the confirmation, it all rushed in at once like a storm crashing through a closed door. His Max, his best friend, the one he had lost, the one he had never stopped searching for in dreams and memories, and now here he was alive, real, not a ghost, not a wish, but real. The woman stood and unlocked the kennel door slowly, cautiously, but Max did not wait. He stepped forward without hesitation, and as soon as the gate opened fully, he walked out and leaned against John's chest with the full weight of his body, as if he was finally home, as if 3 years of fear and waiting could now melt into the warmth of this moment. John wrapped his arms around him without thinking, pressing his face into the thick fur of his neck, inhaling the scent of dirt and shelter, and something that still smelled like the woods, like pine and earth and freedom. Around them, the shelter seemed to fall away, the noise, the smell, the cold light, none of it mattered anymore. It was just the two of them in that moment, a man and his dog, both a little older, both carrying the scars of what had been lost, and now found. Max licked John's face, once then again, and then whined, softly pressing closer as if afraid it might all be a dream. John held him tighter and whispered again, "I found you, buddy, I found you." And Max let out a breath that sounded like relief, like home, like forgiveness. The woman said softly they could begin the paperwork soon. But there was no rush, they could take their time. John nodded slowly, not ready to let go, not ready to move, not yet, because after everything, after all the years, and the silence and the heartbreak, this was the moment he thought would never come, and he was not going to let it pass too quickly. John stayed on the floor with Max for what felt like forever. The sounds of the shelter faded into the background, the barking, the soft voices, the hum of lights, none of it touched him. It was just him and Max. Just the warmth of familiar fur against his chest, the steady beat of a heart he thought was gone forever. Max did not move, except to nuzzle closer as if to erase the space-time had put between them. His tail curled around John's leg, his ears twitching every now and then when someone passed, but his eyes never left John's, not for a second. The shelter worker stepped away, giving them space, but not before setting a blanket on the ground beside them and saying gently, "You can stay here as long as you need. We see a lot of reunions here, but never one like this." John looked up at her, eyes full of something between disbelief and gratitude. He tried to speak, but no words came out, just a slow nod as he pressed his forehead against Max's and closed his eyes, breathing in the moment, letting it settle into every part of him. Max looked older. There were streaks of gray in his coat, his paws rougher than they had been, his eyes more tired, but they still held that same deep, steady calm, the same quiet strength that had always made John feel safe. No matter what was happening in the world around him, he wondered what Max had seen in those 3 years, what miles he had walked alone, what nights he had spent under the stars without a fire, without a voice calling his name. It broke something in John to think of it, to imagine him cold and hungry, searching for something he could not find. But even so, Max had survived. He had endured through storms and silence and loneliness, and somehow he had made it back, as if fate or luck or something greater had drawn him back to where he was meant to be. John thought about the last time he had seen him running into the woods, rain pounding against the earth, lightning splitting the sky, and he remembered the helplessness, the way he had screamed until his throat bled, and the silence that followed when Max never came back. And now here he was, not lost, not gone, not dead, but alive and leaning against him, as though no time had passed, as though love had carried them both through the dark. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the old leather collar he had never thrown away, the one with Max's tag still attached, worn and scratched, but still readable. He held it in his hand for a moment, then gently slipped it over Max's head, the metal clinking softly as it settled into place. Max's ears perked at the sound, and he let out a soft, low huff of contentment. John smiled for the first time in a long time, not the half smile he gave strangers or the polite smile he wore at work, but a real smile full of weight and wonder and something like healing. He looked down at Max and said quietly, "Let's go home, buddy." And Max licked his hand in reply, eyes soft, tail giving a slow, steady wag, not the frantic wag of a dog meeting someone new, but the calm, sure wag of a dog who knows exactly where he belongs. They stood together slowly, both stiff, both sore, both changed by what had been lost and what had been found. The shelter staff watched in quiet amazement as the man and the dog who had defied the odds walked side by side down the hallway, past the cages, past the noise, past the place where lost things waited, and into the light of a world that suddenly seemed a little brighter. John stepped outside into the open air with Max beside him. The sun had come out at some point during their time in the shelter, and it warmed the pavement and glinted off the truck parked just across the lot. For a moment, John just stood there, eyes closed, letting the warmth soak into his skin, letting the feeling settle, because everything felt different now. The weight in his chest, the cold in his bones, it had all started to lift like something long frozen was finally beginning to thaw. Max stayed close, his body brushing against John's leg with every step, as if afraid that even now this might all disappear like some dream too good to be real. John reached down his hand, brushing over the thick fur behind Max's ears, and the dog leaned into his touch the way he always had, not asking for more, just needing to know it was still there, that they were still there together. They reached the truck, and John opened the passenger door, and for a second Max paused, looking up at him, eyes questioning, ears forward, and John nodded, "Go ahead, boy," and Max jumped up into the seat slower than he used to, but still graceful, still familiar, and curled up just like he had so many times before, like he remembered, like he had never left. As John got behind the wheel, he glanced over, and for the first time in years, that seat did not feel empty anymore. He put the key in the ignition and turned it, but didn't drive right away, just sat there, hand resting on the gearshift, staring at Max, who now watched the world through the window, tail thumping quietly against the seat, a rhythm of peace, a rhythm of home. The ride was quiet, neither of them needed noise. The wind through the open windows, the low rumble of the engine, the simple joy of being side by side again. It was enough. John kept stealing glances at Max as they drove down familiar streets, past old stores, past the diner he used to take Max to on Sunday mornings when the weather was good, and they could sit outside with pancakes and eggs, and Max would always wait patiently until John gave him the last bite. When they reached home, the truck rolled to a stop in front of the small house that had never quite felt right since Max had gone. The porch creaked the same way, the paint still chipped at the edges, but now the silence waiting inside felt different, not heavy but expectant, like a place that knew its missing piece was finally coming back. John opened the passenger door, and Max hesitated again for just a breath, as if making sure it was real, and then he leaped down, sniffing the grass, the steps, the front door, as though testing the memories tucked into every inch of this space. His tail rose higher as the scent of it all washed over him. His old world returned to him like a book reopened to the last dogeared page. John unlocked the door, and Max stepped inside before him, walking the familiar path through the living room, past the old couch, and into the kitchen where his empty bowl still sat in the corner, untouched for 3 years, not thrown out, not replaced, just waiting. And when Max saw it, he walked over and sat beside it, looking up at John, not hungry, just waiting, like he used to, like he knew this was home. John stood in the doorway for a long moment, eyes blurred, not from sadness now, but from something gentle, something like peace. He walked over, opened the cabinet, took out a bag of food, and poured it slowly into the bowl, the sound of it echoing through the quiet house. And Max looked down, then back up, then took a slow bite. And with that, everything was real, everything was right again. John sat down at the kitchen table, watching Max eat his food in slow, steady bites, as though savoring every piece, like it had been years since he had tasted anything like it. And maybe in some way it had been. Max's body had been thin when he found him, his ribs visible under his coat. But now, in the safety of this home, with food and water and warmth, Max was finally able to relax, to trust again, and John could see the transformation happening slowly, bit by bit. With every meal, with every quiet moment, the fear was leaving his eyes. The house felt fuller now, not just with the physical presence of Max, but with something deeper, something that had been absent for far too long, something that could not be replaced by anything else. John had tried. He had tried to fill the void in his heart with work, with distractions, with anything that would take the pain away, but nothing had worked, nothing had ever made the ache go away. Not until now, not until Max was here again, the dog who had been his constant companion for years, the one who had been there through everything, even if he had never realized it before. It was as if Max had been waiting for the right moment to return to him. John leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, still trying to make sense of it all, how it had all come together, how Max had survived, how they had found each other again after so much time and distance. But in the end, he realized it didn't matter how or why it had happened, it just had. And that was enough for him, that was all that mattered. The night came quietly, the kind of night where everything felt still and right, and John and Max sat together on the couch, the television playing softly in the background, but neither of them really paying attention. Max had curled up beside him, his head resting on John's lap, like it always had been all those years ago. And John's hand rested gently on his fur, the rhythmic rise and fall of Max's chest, grounding him, reminding him of everything he had almost lost and everything he had found again. It was in that quiet stillness that John realized just how much time had passed, how much life had moved on without him even realizing it. He had spent so many nights feeling like a part of him was missing, and now with Max back, everything felt complete again. In a way he had never thought possible, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they had both been through. It was full of love and understanding, the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud, because it had always been there waiting to return. Max stirred slightly, then looked up at him, eyes soft and calm, the same deep gaze that had always reassured him that everything would be okay. No matter what the storm had been, no matter how far apart they had been, Max had always been with him, even when he had been lost, even when John had thought he was truly gone. And in that moment, John realized that their bond wasn't something that could ever be broken. It was something deeper than just the physical. It was something that had survived the years, the miles, and the pain. As the hours passed, John found himself nodding off, his hand still resting on Max's head, his thoughts slowing down, his body relaxing into the comfort of home, into the comfort of finally having the one thing that had always kept him grounded, the one thing he had missed more than anything else. He drifted in and out of sleep, his mind replaying memories of Max's younger days, of the hikes and the games of fetch, of the mornings when they had been young and carefree, and the future had seemed endless. And even though those days were long gone, and even though they would never be the same again, John knew that this was enough, this moment was enough, because he had Max back. And as the house grew quieter and the darkness deepened outside, John finally fell asleep with Max beside him, both of them safe, both of them home finally. The morning light came slowly creeping through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room, but for the first time in years, John didn't mind the quiet. He woke to the soft pressure of Max's head resting on his lap, and the warm weight of his body pressed close, like nothing had ever been wrong, like the years had never passed, like the silence of those years had been nothing more than a bad dream. He stretched slowly, blinking at the soft sunlight that filtered in, and looked down at Max, who was still sleeping peacefully, his tail twitching slightly in his sleep, as though he was dreaming of something good, something safe. John didn't want to move, he didn't want to disturb the moment, the stillness that hung in the air like a promise that everything would be okay, that nothing would ever be the same as before. But that didn't mean it couldn't be just as good, if not better. He ran a hand through Max's fur, gently, careful not to wake him, just taking in the warmth and the comfort of having his dog back, having his friend back after everything, the absence, the loss, the endless days of wondering if he would ever see him again. And now here he was, right here with him in this moment. It felt surreal, as though he had dreamed it all up, but every time he looked down at Max's face, he knew it was real. He knew this was the life he had wanted, the life he had missed, the life he had almost given up on, because the emptiness had been sold out for so long. But now the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something new, full of possibility and hope and love, the kind that had always been there, even in the darkest of times. John stood slowly, careful not to disturb Max too much, and walked into the kitchen to start the coffee, the warmth of the cup in his hands grounding him even further. As he moved around the room, he could hear Max shifting behind him, and when he turned around, he saw the dog standing at the door, watching him with those same steady eyes that never wavered no matter what was happening around them. John smiled and walked over to the door, unlocking it and letting Max step out into the yard, his paws crunching on the gravel as he walked around the familiar space, like he was remembering it, like it had been waiting for him to return. John stood on the porch watching Max roam the yard, sniffing at the fence and the trees the same way he had done before, just taking in the sense of home, like it was all new again, like he had to reacquaint himself with everything. But there was no rush, no hurry. Max was home now, and John was content to just let him be here, to let him take his time. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the trees and rustling the leaves, and for the first time John didn't feel the ache of loneliness. He didn't feel the sharp sting of what he had lost. He only felt the peace of what he had found, the presence of Max at his side, the steady rhythm of the world moving forward without leaving him behind. He watched Max for a while, just standing there, feeling the moments stretch out between them, feeling the bond between them grow stronger. The more time they spent together, the more they shared of the simple everyday things, the things that hadn't mattered before, but now felt like everything: the sound of birds in the trees, the warmth of the sun on his face, the way the world seemed to slow down when Max was around. When Max finally returned to the porch, John knelt down to meet him halfway, and the dog pressed his head into John's chest in that familiar way, the same way he always had, and John wrapped his arms around him, hugging him close just as he had all those years ago. Only now the hug felt different. It felt like a promise, like a beginning rather than an end. John whispered quietly, "You're home. Now, boy, you're finally home." And Max licked his hand in reply, as if to say yes, this was where he belonged, where they both belonged, and for the first time in a long time, John believed it too. They stayed outside for a while longer, the sun rising higher in the sky as the world around them woke up. And John didn't want to leave this moment, didn't want to think about anything else but the fact that Max was here now, and no matter what had happened in the past, no matter how far they had been apart, they had found each other again, and that was all that mattered. And as the day stretched out before them, John knew that whatever came next, whatever the future held, he and Max would face it together, just as they always had.